I thought that I'd take a break from my usual music analysis videos to share some of my favorite albums that came out this year. Now you might be wondering, why a top 9? Why not a top 10? Well, I suppose 10 is a nice round number, but it's kind of arbitrary. I think the number should be in service of the music, not the other way around, and this year I found only 9 albums that are worth putting into a best of video. I couldn't find a 10th that was quite as good as the other 9. It's possible that I simply may have not listened to enough music. I was only able to really digest 118 new albums this year, as opposed to 222 new albums last year. And fittingly, last year's list was a top 12. But maybe 2023 was just a slightly better year for music than 2024. Of course, I encourage you to share your own 2024 top albums in the comments. I'm sure you'll point out plenty of good ones, and I'll be kicking myself for not finding them on my own. So without much further ado, here are my 9 favorite albums of 2024. I don't want to get any copyright strikes, so no actual music, but feel free to use the Bandcamp links in the description to sample the albums as we go. Starting with number 9, Stay the Same by Chris P. Thompson. As far as I can tell, Chris P. Thompson is not a very well-known artist. He's only got 154 monthly listeners on Spotify, for instance. This isn't a dig, mind you. If anything, I just hope that I can get him some more attention, because his album Stay the Same is a bizarre yet strangely accessible masterwork of both microtonal music and experimental electronica. I keep being tempted to call this album vaporwave, even though it's pretty far from that genre's usual aesthetic. Still, there's something in this album's approach which uses a similar perspective. Namely, it considers not only the musicality of sound, but its basic recognizability, and then goes on to decontextualize both of these elements. This attitude is most apparent in the album's vocal parts. On the track Different Pressures, for instance, they are chopped and garbled into a sort of musical sculpture, whereas on Selfie they are made artificially clear but weirdly contextless. With gaudy synthesizers and foamy percussion, this latter track could be mistaken for something by vaporwave legend Oneohtrix Point Never. But the real meat of Stay the Same is in its instrumental arrangements. A lot of these use the familiar sound of a piano, though its harmonies are made unfamiliar by microtonal just intonation tunings. The meditative track Sculpture Garden sticks to the most consonant intervals, which feel almost therapeutic in their hyper-pure tonality. UV Garden has a similarly slow pace, but employs crunchier chords. The listener is given ample room to contemplate them within the track's minimalist arrangement. In fact, the album tends towards minimalism in general, but quite a few tracks feel nonetheless highly animated. For instance, the piano arrangement on Mirror creates a churning blanket of trembling, artificially staccato 16th notes. The tension builds as more and more exotic microtones are added, until finally a synthesizer starts doubling these notes, recalling the modular synth loops of, say, Caterina Barbieri. The track Philip Thinking takes an inverse approach, starting with a synthesizer loop in a 5/8 meter and then developing dramatic piano accompaniment underneath it. The repetitive, evenly spaced composition of these tracks are emblematic of Stay the Same's focus on harmony and texture over rhythm, but there are a few tracks which experiment with more explicit syncopation. One example is The Help You Need, which gradually turns from straight eighths to triplets and then to a full-blown metric modulation. Meanwhile, the track Changes breaks down rhythm even further until once again it becomes a textural element. Describing these features makes the album seem like some kind of a formal experiment, but magically it avoids sounding sterile or intellectualized. It seems acutely aware of how its conceptual digital aesthetic can be alienating, and so it strives to portray its more organic elements, the piano, the voice, the harmony, so that they seem to peek out helplessly from deep within, creating a sense of pathos that can be hard to achieve with largely synthetic music. This unexpected emotional component makes Stay the Same much more than the sum of its parts, and something that anyone interested in experimental electronica should check out. Next, at number 8, Paramainomeni by Oplites. Seeing the band name, album title, and album artwork, you would be forgiven for thinking that Oplites is Greek, but actually the sole writing member of the musical project, Liu Zhenyang, is from China. It turns out that his scholarly proficiency in ancient Greek is put to use here in order to avoid censorship from the Chinese state. Of course, I don't understand the lyrics either, but based on the vocal delivery of this incredibly aggressive black metal album, I'd wager that Liu is mightily pissed off about something. This album has most of the standard features of black metal: high-pitched, shrieking vocals, dissonant tremolo-picked guitar, and of course pummeling blast beats. But this music goes much further than this in its experimental approach. On Bandcamp, one of the tags for this album is Blackened Soil, which I found surprisingly accurate. Soil, of course, is a form of progressive rock developed by the French band Magma in the 1970s, characterized by elements of jazz fusion and neoclassical music. A typical Soil song might alternate between complex chamber compositions, wild prog freakouts, and repetitive, almost ritualistic-sounding themes. On Paramainomeni, Oplites successfully imports this multi-pronged approach into extreme metal. There's a lot of technical skill on display here, almost more in line with what you'd hear in mathcore or prog metal. To begin with, the drumming is an onslaught of angular stop-and-start rhythmic patterns, unusual time signatures, and frequent tempo changes. And though the guitar is also quite technical, it often emphasizes texture and motion over harmonic content, giving its atonal, tritone-heavy riffs a sort of freeform character. The opening track starts with some wild full-neck guitar slides, while early on track 3, the riffs have a lurching quality that embellishes a chaotic breakdown rhythm on the drums. This aesthetic even extends to the album's production style. The razor-sharp guitar timbre would perhaps seem overproduced if it were on another album, but it's used here to give its bizarre riff shapes an overwhelming in-your-face impact. The artificial on-off guitar effect that dominates the end of track 3 and the digital-sounding guitar bends halfway through track 4 are a few examples of this. One of the most distinctive parts of Paramainomeni, though, is its usage of saxophone. During heavier sections, it howls and grunts like something off John Zorn's Naked City, but it's also instrumental in setting the vibe of the album's periodic lower-intensity sections, such as the brief intro to track 6. There, its expressive, doomy approach is much more explicitly reminiscent of the trance-like aspects of Zoil. This combination of saxophone with metal is not unprecedented, and to me it's most reminiscent of certain cuts from the Keodot album Hubardo, a personal favorite which employs a similar blackened avant-garde style. Overall, Paramainomeni is not for the faint of heart, but for metalheads who want something that sounds like the auditory equivalent of dental surgery, this highly idiosyncratic cut of technical metal is an excellent choice. Then, at number 7, Planet Pearl by Pearl and the Oysters. I've been a fan of Pearl and the Oysters since their 2021 album Flowerland, which took psychedelic pop with some vintage elements and infused it with easygoing bossa nova vibes. A well-written album, to be sure, but on the band's latest release, Planet Pearl, I feel that they have achieved a career best. It's almost like a thought experiment made real. What would it be like if the second wave of bossa nova in the 1960s happened 20 years later during the advent of the synthesizer? The result is breezy and downright fun, but no less sophisticated for it. Pearl and the Oysters are no strangers to synthesizers, but on Planet Pearl, they commit more fully to the synth-pop sound than ever before. This ranges from bouncy bass lines to heavily filtered pads, and of course a variety of organ or electric piano imitations which are better suited to the album's complex harmonies. These are all balanced by a range of more conventional instruments. The snappy drum tone recalls 80s R&B pop hits, while guitar and even flute occasionally make an appearance, such as on the bridge of the catchy shuffle-rhythm track Cruise Control. But critically, above everything else, is the pure and delicate voice of singer Juliette Pearl Davis, sounding much like a latter-day Astrud Gilberto. Her glossy, uninflected style of singing fits perfectly with her lyrics, which paint a sort of babe-in-the-woods picture of modern disaffection. This vocal delivery also meshes perfectly with both the drippy synthetic textures while still tying into the classic bossa nova sound. I've mentioned this bossa nova influence a few times, so let me expound on it for a moment. A lot of it boils down to certain harmonic features in the song's chord progressions, namely the use of high-level modal interchange or key changes, complex jazz voicings, especially including major ninths and suspended dominant chords, and also lots of polytonal slash chords. The song A Planet Upside Down is a great example of this style of harmony, sounding like something torn from the Chico Buarque songbook. These features are keenly sentimental, sometimes tranquil, but at other times yielding a soft sense of melancholy, the feeling of saudade so often claimed by Brazilian culture. This depth of feeling in Planet Pearl is magnified by its arrangements, which cleverly blend synthpop and bossa nova in a way that produces a maximum of variety. Songs like Together Alone and Triangular Girl lean into lounge jazz balladry, while on the opposite end of the spectrum, Big Time and album opener Side Quest are infectiously effervescent and radio-friendly. Still, there's an underlying aesthetic common to all these songs, a feeling that they're all cut from the same cloth. Of course, you don't need to think too hard to appreciate Planet Pearl, but it provides deeper joys than its surface-level catchiness, making it an album that has stuck with me over a range of moods. I hope it does the same for you. At number 6 is Meaning's Edge by Drum. The discography of the IDM artist Drum is pretty light on album-length releases. This one's practically short enough to be an EP, although it's crammed with a double LP quantity of detail. My main point of comparison for Drum's style of electronic music is Squarepusher, who in contrast has a massive discography. But both artists use the same mix of drum and bass, acid techno, and IDM tropes, while also transcending these conventions with an approach that delves deeply into both composition and timbre. To talk more specifically about Meaning's Edge, the first thing I noticed was the huge diversity of sounds, especially impressive for what is largely sample-based music. And more than just variety, it's the way in which every drum hit or note is sculpted. Any sound on this album is fair game for manipulation, using everything from changes in pitch or velocity to a whole spectrum of filters and effects. And then even those items are parametrized and manipulated again. The outcome is so abstract that what might be considered synthetic at first blush is soon granted a measure of the organic. The composition of these tracks deftly capitalizes on this technique, using it to provide shape and identity to each instrumental part, no matter how small. yet the impact is often maximalist. For example, just over 2 minutes into Crawl, there's a part where the entire array of instruments seems to fuse into a single continuous 16th note figure, which then slowly morphs, with various aspects of its timbre bursting forth and dying away. This kind of incessant, sprawling rhythm is another common feature on Meaning's Edge, partly to be expected from its genre, but unlike other drum and bass artists, a lot of the groove here doesn't use breakbeats to imitate normal drum patterns. Instead, it infuses fast but even percussion with accents or timbral twists. In a way, it's a bit like the linear funk drumming technique that became prominent in the 1970s, but unlike funk, it often reaches an insane pace, almost incomprehensible as anything more than texture. In other places, like Frechem Part 2, the tempo slows down to the more familiar, entrancing syncopations of techno. Some of the instrumental elements also occasionally fall back on more recognizable ideas. Codex, for example, flirts with stock breakbeat samples, but only as brief gestures that die away into more abstract territory. This track also features a squelchy bass synth sound, something that harkens to Squarepusher's Go Plastic, though now it's sort of a genre standard. And just like Squarepusher balances his sample or synth-based material with the more analog sound of his bass guitar, Drum seems to have an affection for wind instruments. The first 3 tracks primarily use this as atmosphere, with long ethereal flute notes that contrast with the busy percussion. But starting on Frechem Part 1, the flute suddenly becomes a compositional element, playing lively arpeggiations that follow a rhythmic structure drawn from funk or hip-hop. Though as always, as the track progresses, everything mutates past the point of recognition. Overall, Meaning's Edge is a bold exploration of the very concept of sound. Just make sure you listen to it on good quality headphones. Next, at number 5, Eden Trough by Aseitas. One of the challenges of making highly technical progressive death metal is figuring out how to make all the complexity mean something. At a certain level of proficiency, it's academically easy to write something complicated, but it's a whole other thing to make it sound meaningful. Aseitas navigate this challenge perfectly on Eden Trough. Even the lean 30-minute runtime reflects a certain rarefaction of tech death ideas into their most essential form. Perhaps surprisingly, there's not a lot of outright experimentation with genre on this album. For all its merits, it dutifully checks every box on the prog/tech death style sheet. If anything, it leans towards mere prog rock in a few places, such as the transitional 3rd track with its creepy ambient piano, and the outro of the song Tiamat, whose melodic guitar lines eventually develop into acoustic guitar noodling. But for the most part, Eden Trough is just an assortment of incredibly heavy and moreover heavily inventive riffage. It's all played with impressive speed and intensity, using an insurge of time signatures that are sure to reward any prog metal nerd. But what exactly makes this album exceptional is how well these riffs balance all this complexity with familiar tropes or repeated motifs. I really have to bring up the album closer Alabaster Bones, which has some of the juiciest rhythmic ideas I've ever heard, full stop. It starts with a prominent 5/4 polyrhythm and then takes the 5 count and shortens it to 4 while placing another polyrhythmic 5 underneath. And if you have no idea what I mean by this, that's perfectly fine, because the outward appearance of this riff is totally coherent even without any understanding of this conceptual underpinning. Its satisfying guitar chugs and weirdly martial-sounding drums give definition and thematic consistency to what is, on the surface, just some kind of tricky tempo change. Towards the end of this track, the tempo starts increasing gradually and steadily, eventually doubling, quadrupling, octupling, while the composition keeps cutting out notes to compensate. Even a layperson can intuitively get what this section is doing, though, especially due to its sparse and simple drum patterns. Of course, some of this album's accessibility is also due to clever, layered arrangement. The last riff sequence on Libertine Captor, for instance, gradually builds up density in an eminently recognizable way, adding clear, pingy ride bells to accent the weird meter of the underlying guitar. Eventually, the drums fill this out with emphasis on some overriding 3/8 figures. This is tech death that you can groove to. But even in many of the denser passages, Eden Trough's high production quality manages to maintain an impression of clarity. The drums are crisp, there's a nice bass presence, and the guitar distortion is luscious, especially in the bell-clear natural harmonics such as those in the opening of Tiamat. Even when the album's profane intensity is at its peak, a careful listener can perceive every detail, and I hope that you're one of these listeners, as this is one of 2024's most breathtaking releases. Then, at number 4, Mute by Khat. I've never liked the label World Music, but it actually kind of makes sense to use for the band Khat. Originally based in Israel, but now located in Germany, with members from Yemen, Morocco, Poland, and Iraq, Khat creates wandering, plaintive music for and by displaced people. The core influence for this sound is the Yemeni music that bandleader Eyal al-Wahhab grew up listening to, characterized by microtonal scales much like those in the Arab Maqam tradition. There's been a recent surge of interest in this style throughout the Western world, but a lot of contemporary renditions of it seem somehow watered down, softening the harsh impact of this tuning's sour notes by massaging them into familiar Western chord progressions and burying them inside anemic production sensibilities. Listening to Mute, on the other hand, is like mainlining Maqam. It largely sticks to the Rast Bayati Sikka axis of scales, but if you're not prepared for raw, uncompromising quarter tones, it can still be quite a jolt. This is amplified by the stark heterophonic approach to melody. There's often just one melodic line, twisting and mutating as different instruments join or leave, with each imparting their own articulation and inflections. The ending riff of Mute's final track, Intisar, shows off this concept quite well. To that end, the album has quite a variety of instruments. Often they just appear, like an old friend who happens to be in town for only a few minutes. Many of the instruments are apparently invented by El Wahhab himself, especially the various percussion pieces. But the real magic is how the production affects everything, with ample saturation and strong yet natural reverb and delay, which make it seem like we're hearing these songs played on a loudspeaker in a bombed-out coffeehouse or alley. The horn section on La Walla blares like an angry demonstration, and the organ on Almania screeches and echoes like a desert circus. There's always a cohesive lower structure to this, though. El Wahhab plays most of it on whatever guitar-like instrument he uses, often doubling this on vocals. With clanging percussion underneath, together all these elements form a strident symphony. And on the topic of percussion, one of Mute's most beguiling tricks is its use of micro-rhythms. On many songs, the beat has a stuttering unevenness, with rhythmic subdivisions not falling into the power of two grids so common to Western music. Some of this is reminiscent of the Gnawa rhythms native to Morocco, but there's many other approaches too. The song Zafa is a good showpiece for this, its pounding drums having an almost speech-like cadence. Amazingly, every instrument manages to lock into these rhythms without following them mindlessly. There's a fair amount of improvisation inside this unsteady structure. Overall, Mute is an evocative and intense example of so-called world music, with excellent musicianship to boot. It's the kind of thing to play at top volume while you meditate on the conflicts of the world. Next at number 3, Anthropometricks by Trio HLK. I hadn't heard of Trio HLK before this year. They only have one other album from 2018, and their three main band members, Rich Harold, Ant Law, and Richard Cass, have only a few other albums from the past decade. I suppose maybe they've poured all their recent efforts into this release, because Anthropometricks is nothing if not the most intricate, mystifying cut of modern chamber jazz I've heard in recent memory. Although jazz may not be the perfect label. On the surface, this album may have many of the trappings of a typical jazz trio release, but a lot of jazz conventions such as swing rhythms, dominant chord-focused harmony, and extensive improvisation are conspicuously absent here. Rather, this album is full of abstract, highly chromatic harmony that is conveyed in a series of tightly imbricated and rhythmically complex compositions. The rhythmic approach in particular is somewhat reminiscent of chamber jazz groups on the Ronin rhythm music label such as Icarus, Kali Trio, or Shabui, who emphasize both unusual meters and long-form polymeters. But the style of those artists leans towards the atmospheric, the music's texture building gradually and evolving slowly and consistently, whereas Trio HLK's style is much more unpredictable and immediate. Anthropometricks is full of odd meters, contrasting rhythms, and tuplets, but rarely are these features locked into a rigidly repeating framework. As a result, the music always seems to be on the verge of falling apart. The track Concertinas for Bill takes this concept to an extreme with its constantly shifting tempo, but on the other tracks it is not the tempo but the structure itself that shifts, even changing entirely if necessary, and usually with a suddenness that befits the intensity of this music. And make no mistake, this is some very intense music. The mind-bending complexity of these compositions is often magnified by headlong speed and a heavy-handed playing style, though still retaining the slippery, organic quality of jazz. The guitar is particularly beefy, with the opening of Apostrophe Part 2 sounding vaguely like a cross between progressive metal and maybe one of Tigran Hamasyan's heavier tracks. And the addition of guest Natalie Klein on cello makes the penultimate section of the quintuplet-centric track 5 sound much like one of Mahavishnu Orchestra's more lurching, apocalyptic cuts. This energy is mirrored in the album's approach to harmony. It abandons straightforward chord functions in favor of impressionistic polytonal chords, which are used to support angular melodies with almost surrealist-sounding shapes. The rhythmic style magnifies the feverish dissonance of these motifs, forcing them to either repeat insistently or to undergo surreal mutations. On the more intense tracks, this latter process is accelerated to a dizzying speed. Flanagan's Lament stands out in this regard, delivering a constant flux of melody with seemingly little repetition. On lower intensity sections, like the intro to Stellar, the result is more dreamlike and evocative, though still quite abstract. Anthropometricks is quite a challenging album, but its intensity and the sheer audacity of its songwriting make it endlessly engaging. If you can manage to tune into its ideas, you're in for a wild ride. Then, at number 2, Muuntautuja by Oranssi Pazuzu. I've been a big fan of Finland's Oranssi Pazuzu for a while now. In fact, their previous release, Mestarin Kinsi, was my favorite album of 2020. So I guess you could say I had high expectations for 2024's Muuntautuja. Fortunately, the band's idiosyncratic style has created yet another masterpiece, as unnervingly dissonant as it is experimental. This band often gets labeled as psychedelic black metal, and indeed there are a few surface-level similarities to black metal, such as its harsh, raspy vocals, distorted guitar texture, and relatively unstructured composition. But here, Oranssi Pazuzu constantly reinvent these features in service of a musical aesthetic that is both brutal and completely alien. In many ways, though, Muuntautuja is more restrained than their previous efforts. Mester and Kinsey was rather carnivalesque in its atmosphere, with lots of lurid, manic synthesizers, and while Muuntautuja has its share of synthesizers as well, they mostly lurk under the surface, often literally, with the bass synth playing a major role, such as the understated dub-like groove on Hautatuli, or the rhythmic bass pulse on the album's title track. In the higher frequency ranges, the album's restraint manifests as softer organic timbres. A lot of these are still electronic pads, such as the creepy detuned choir effect towards the end of Bioalchemisti, but the most common choice is actually piano, which lends astral-sounding arpeggios to both Voitelu as well as the penultimate section of Valutus. But despite all this restraint, the album is just as violent and chaotic as its predecessor. There's no shortage of loud riffs, though few of them have any resemblance to conventional metal. The guitars largely abandon melody for sheer motion, using bends or slides to produce sounds akin to wailing or groaning. Richly layered and combined with an ample dose of effects pedals, the result is like a huge and barely coherent wave of noise. The vocals often seem like just one more component of this wave, and sometimes effects and filters turn the usual black metal screams into inhuman cackles or robotic murmurs. What little structure exists is often locked down by the bass guitar. Unlike the bass synth, it is crunchy and rhythmic, usually repeating a simple trance-like theme as the guitars swirl above. In fact, much of the composition is simple and repetitive, but do not mistake these qualities for boring. Take the drums, for example. They play with much less density than typical black metal, preferring the skeletal rhythms of krautrock or the simple but relentlessly forward-moving feel of surf rock. Yet this minimalism is always tempered by something eccentric, such as the odd snare placement on Voitelu or the 5/4 beat on Ikakarme that conflicts with the rest of its song structure. There are practically no blast beats, the sole exception to this being the incessant hammering rhythm that opens Valutus. But even this derives most of its impact from its 13/8 time signature, which has an eerily unbalanced quality. So even as Muuntautuja varies from black metal tropes, it still manages to achieve the same morbid effect. If anything, it mostly resembles black metal in attitude, a rejection of normal musical guidelines in service of shocking or disturbing its listeners. And finally, at number 1, Reason in Motion by Utopianisti. It looks like it's been a good year for Finnish music. Markus Pajakala, also known as Utopianisti, is a multi-instrumentalist from Tampere, Finland. Most of his albums are in the general jazz/avant-prog realm, but now on Reason in Motion he dives headlong into Afrobeat. And although many other Utopianisti albums have the flavor of solo projects with some guest musicians at hand, this one was recorded live in studio with a 9-piece band, mostly Finnish musicians but including 2 percussionists/vocalists from Senegal and Mauritius respectively. The live recording is an important fact to bring up because Afrobeat is a genre that lives on its ability to infuse rhythm with exuberant aliveness. And if nothing else, this music sounds alive. It's easy to imagine it coming from a block party right outside your window. But it's never sloppy, which is actually quite a feat considering how tricky many of these songs are. And ultimately, this is why Reason in Motion is my favorite album of 2024. For all its compositional complexity, listening to it is just so much damn fun. The propulsive quality of this music, its irresistible call to get up off of that thing, is in part due to the sheer size of this album's lineup, with the many parts creating a continuous and highly dynamic texture. This is compounded by the bold instrumentation, which features a ruthless brass section, the sharp slap of hand drums, and even a few over-the-top electric guitar solos. Yet there's also a subtle, organic give and take between the musicians here that is hard to achieve in mere single-instrument recordings. Even for the album's simpler parts, syncopation and layering renders the total effect with a sense of greater dimension. Along these lines, the arrangement is full of 3-on-2 polyrhythms as well as the typical call and response figures common to Afrobeat. The dazzling horn interplay at the midpoint of Kleptocrats is a great example of this latter technique. But even in isolation, a lot of these parts are quite elaborate, drawing from the tendencies of other Utopianisti projects. Much of these consist of athletic melodic lines based on standard 16th-note funk syncopation, though others have more subtle or unexpected melodic phrasings, such as the 9/8 horn figures that override Yaganu Bata's 6/8 clave pattern, or the 5/16 figures locked inside Hit It With the Pinkies 4/4 structure. The harmonic features of Reason in Motion diverge even further from the Afrobeat format, though at times they touch on similar genres, such as the album opener Greenwash, which channels the slinky melodic shapes of ethio-jazz. There's also an oddly recurrent use of the Phrygian mode, most notably on album closer La Nuit des Morts Vivants, which sounds like a psychedelic jazz soundtrack for a descent into the underworld. And of course there's still a touch of the Nordic jazz approach, with the stately melodic contours of No Culture, No Soul, for instance, sounding like something Yaga Yazist could have written. Despite all of this, a few tracks stick to the more standard Afrobeat tropes, such as the extensive improvisation on the Fela Kuti-esque track All Whale Panel. Again, it's this balance of complexity and catchiness that makes this album fun and kept me coming back over and over again. And there you have it, my top 9 albums of 2024. I hope that I've been able to get you to try out a few of these, and if you do, I hope that you enjoy them as deeply as I have. Of course, as I said before, I invite you to leave your favorite albums of the year in the comments. I'll definitely check out as many of them as I can. But regardless, I'll see you next year, and hopefully I'll have some more music analysis content for you soon.